What comes to your mind when I say trade wars?
US and China.
The US-China.
US-China trade tensions are sparking.
Yep, that's what I thought. Now the question is, why does it stop at a trade war? Why does it not turn into a full-blown war? Both the US and China have been in a tug-of-war for a while now. The US is fighting to maintain its economic dominance over the world. And China, in the meantime, is doing everything in its capacity to overtake the US as the world's leading superpower. Some might say that this intense rivalry is a perfect example of the Thucydides trap, where one rising power threatens the dominance of an existing great power. Thucydides, an ancient Greek historian, observed this phenomenon of shifting power dynamics in the Peloponnesian War. Athens was continuing to rise as a great economic and military power in the region, which challenged the Spartan domination. This contest for political power between the two states eventually ended in a catastrophic war that hurt the financial infrastructure of both parties on a very large scale. Now, if the US and China were to engage in that kind of a war, it would end up being far more destructive and devastating than the two world wars combined. So why doesn't this happen? It could be because the US owes China several hundred billions of dollars. China has been and still is one of the biggest creditors to the US debt. To say it more precisely, China owns more than $859 billion of US debt. Now, foreign debt is actually a pretty common concept in modern geoeconomics. Borrowing money from other nations is a pretty practical and effective tool to sustain the economy of a nation. In fact, our current world economy is so interconnected that oftentimes it is much easier to borrow capital from other countries than it is to find domestic lenders. As a result, there is hardly a single country in the world that doesn't owe some sort of external debt. However, it's particularly controversial when a country like the US owes huge amounts of debt to a nation like China, which is its biggest rival for economic dominance in the world and an outright threat to its allies in the Indo-Pacific. This relation of the US as the borrower and China as the lender, the US as the spender and China as the saver, has been a subject of a lot of debates over the years. But how did this happen? How did a country with a GDP per capita of a little over $100 until 1970 become the banker to the world's largest economy? Moreover, is there anything Uncle Sam gains from this relationship? Well, to answer that question, we have to go a few decades back, just about 50 years. After the death of Mao Zedong in the 1970s, China was just an isolated country on the other side of the Pacific Ocean with severe poverty. But then, under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, China began its journey of political and economic reforms which were to take China out of isolation and open the country to the outside world. This resulted in China attracting foreign direct investments. This inflow of capital was used to build highways, ports, and manufacturing plants. China was set to increase its national wealth by making products and selling them to the outside world. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. This was a crucial step that reduced the barriers to international trade markets and entered the country into a global economic stage. And this brought in even more foreign investments, therefore making China's manufacturing capabilities even better. China figured out its strategy. It had two clear objectives. Number one was to utilize the large pool of labor available in the country, and number two was to manufacture effective and cheap products with huge volumes. China's industrial sector grew at an unprecedented rate, and the global demand for cheaper goods was only increasing. China's transformation was astounding. From a GDP of just about $100 billion in 1970, it is now projected to surpass $18 trillion by the end of this year. And you have mainly one country to thank for importing so many of these Chinese manufactured goods. And yep, you guessed it right, it's the United States of America. According to census data, American imports increased by 5 times to almost $504 billion a year in the 2 decades following China's introduction to the WTO. Gaining most from this trade was the average Joe in the US. Every American could now buy goods cheaper than ever before. A study by the American Economic Association observed that 0.19% annual reduction in American prices occurred between 2004 and 2015. And from 2000 to 2007, the spending power of an average American household rose by 2%, which equals $1,500 a year. And all of this was caused by an increased trade with, you guessed it, China. So what did China do with all this capital influx from its US customers? They bought US Treasury securities, and they bought a lot of them. This helped China with two big objectives. First, China could invest the surplus from the American market into a safe asset with a decent rate of return. Second, to prevent the yuan from appreciating due to massive inflow of dollars, the People's Bank of China would buy US Treasury securities. This helped them keep the price of the yuan artificially low, as a result, offering more stable and predictable exchange rates. Now, the artificially undervalued yuan in turn made Chinese exports significantly cheaper in the global market, further fueling its boosting manufacturing sector and rapid growth in the export-driven economy. The US also benefited from China's massive purchase of US Treasury bonds, as it allowed them to keep interests low in their own country. All of this made borrowing cheaper for the US government, businesses, and consumers. However, this economic interdependence between the US and China wasn't all bright and optimistic. The inexpensive imports from China hurt the US manufacturing sector massively. It contributed to a widening trade deficit between the two countries, raising concerns about job losses and offshoring. From 1999 to 2011, almost 1 million manufacturing jobs in the US were whipped out. More than 2 million people in the overall national economy lost their positions. One could argue that this decline in the local industry was one of the primary driving forces that fueled Donald Trump's presidential success. His promises to unleash a quote-unquote trade war resonated deeply with a large pocket of the population who had lost their incomes to inexpensive imports from China with which they could not compete. Moving back a little bit, the financial crisis of 2008 also made the US federal offices realize that heavily relying on Beijing to purchase US Treasury funds to sustain their low-interest borrowing in the country would only hurt the economic infrastructure long term. And to top it all off, China wasn't playing by the book. In many instances, there were reports of violations happening in international trade laws to gain competitive advantage. Several Chinese manufacturers managed to sidestep environmental and labor regulations in many instances. And despite being part of the global market, foreign companies faced significant challenges when they tried to enter the Chinese market. In the US news, you started to hear more and more about how Chinese manufacturers were stealing intellectual property and causing widespread counterfeiting of American products. These tensions started to increase significantly. Okay, so let's fast forward to the 2010s. Both China and the US started to reassess their economic strategies, focusing on reducing their mutual dependence. The US tried to diminish their over-reliance on Chinese manufacturing, and they started looking at other countries like Vietnam, Mexico, and India. These emerging economies started to rise as alternative manufacturing hubs. They also offered competitive advantages in certain industries. The share of imports from China in the US had decreased, and the growing geopolitical rivalry with the US had also encouraged China to reduce its holdings in the US trust funds. The Chinese purchase of the US debts had been consistently declining since 2012 and has decreased by more than 17% since January 2022 alone. Now, of course, all this seems like both Washington and Beijing are determined to decouple, a divorce almost, but it doesn't seem like a very practical and immediate solution. I mean, a lot of stuff that we use every day has only been made possible because of this Sino-American partnership. Various enterprises, from cell phone companies to electric automakers to healthcare equipment, rely heavily on Chinese manufacturers and American R&D. Now, the US aims to outsource a lot of its manufacturing capabilities to countries like Vietnam, but it's ironic because countries like Vietnam actually source a large quantity of their parts and materials from goods from China. You see, the US isn't necessarily diminishing its dependence on China by importing from alternative markets. They're just adding a few extra steps, complicating the global supply chain. Now, despite this seemingly unavoidable economic interdependence, the growing geopolitical tensions between China and the US are set to impact the global trade market. Remember how I talked about the Thucydides trap earlier? Well, as the US and China position themselves for global leadership, a prospect of the Thucydides trap starts to loom large. Now, a lot of this truly depends on how policies in the US are shaped. And there's this practice in the US called lobbying, which truly influences how these policies actually do pan out. So I think it might be relevant for you to check out this video that I made about how lobbying works in the US and how the history of lobbying came to be. So check it out here if you haven't already, and subscribe to the channel, please. It really does help me out a lot. So thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next one.